They called her the crying lady with the dying ranch behind her back until the bank statements came out. What transformed a grieving housewife into the most feared competitor in cattle country wasn't luck, connections, or inheritance money. It was a single conversation with a stranger that revealed the industry's biggest blind spot, and she exploited it ruthlessly. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in 1847, changing everything for the small frontier town of Cedar Ridge. Sarah McKinnon was now a widow at 28, and more shocking to the locals, she owned the biggest cattle ranch in 3 counties. Her husband Thomas had died suddenly from fever while driving cattle to market, leaving behind 2,000 head of longhorn, 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, and a woman the townspeople barely knew. Word spread faster than wildfire through the dusty streets. At Murphy's General Store, old-timers shook their heads over tobacco and whiskey. "Ain't natural," muttered Jake Brennan, whose own spread bordered the McKinnon land. "Woman's got no business running cattle." The barber agreed while trimming beards, the blacksmith nodded between hammer strikes, and even the preacher wondered aloud if the good Lord intended such arrangements. Well, their doubts weren't just talk. By week's end, reality hit hard. 4 of the 6 ranch hands packed their bedrolls and rode out without asking for wages. "Working for a woman brings nothing but bad luck," declared Hank Morrison, who'd worked McKinnon cattle for 3 years. The others mumbled agreement, citing everything from superstition to simple embarrassment. They'd rather dig ditches or break horses than take orders from someone who wore skirts and braided her hair each morning. Then there's the matter of neighboring ranchers circling like buzzards. Makes sense, right? They smelled opportunity in Sarah's supposed weakness. Clayton Garrett showed up first, hat in hand, and sympathy dripping from every word. "Real sorry about Thomas, ma'am. Of course, you'll be wanting to head back east where ladies belong. I'd be happy to take this burden off your shoulders. Say 50 cents on the dollar?" His smile revealed tobacco-stained teeth and pure calculation. The offer was insulting considering prime ranch land sold for $3 an acre minimum. But Garrett wasn't alone in his generosity. Within 10 days, 5 different men knocked on Sarah's door with similar proposals. Each claimed concern for her welfare while offering prices that would barely cover Thomas's funeral expenses. They spoke slowly, as if she couldn't understand basic arithmetic, explaining how cattle ranching required man's work and natural strength. The weird part is how convinced they all seemed of their own logic. County Judge Harrison himself paid a visit, suggesting Sarah might find comfort in more suitable female pursuits. He recommended teaching school or taking in sewing, anything that didn't involve managing livestock and hiring cowboys. "The frontier's no place for a woman alone," he declared, as if Sarah hadn't been living there for 5 years already. Local wives weren't much better. They whispered behind gloved hands at church socials, predicting disaster within months. "She'll lose every head to rustlers," predicted Mrs. Whitmore, whose own husband struggled to keep 50 cattle alive each winter. "Mark my words, wolves and weather will finish what grief started." Banking proved even more challenging than gossip. When Sarah rode into town to discuss the ranch accounts, Banker Stevens treated her like an unwelcome curiosity. He spoke only of selling quickly before inevitable losses mounted up. The man actually suggested she might not understand the difference between assets and debts, despite Sarah keeping the household books for years. And the humor in this situation? These same men had praised Thomas McKinnon's operation for years, never acknowledging that Sarah managed the ranch finances, negotiated feed prices, and planned cattle rotations while he handled the driving and selling. Local sentiment wasn't just skeptical, it was downright hostile. Cowboys from other spreads made jokes about the Petticoat Ranch when they came to town. Store owners wondered aloud whether Sarah's credit was good without a man's signature. Even the young boys who cleaned stables snickered about a woman trying to boss around bulls and broncos. Let's not forget the practical challenges that seemed insurmountable to outside observers. 2,000 head of cattle needed constant attention, checking water sources, maintaining fences, watching for predators and disease. Winter meant hauling feed through snow and ice. Spring brought calving season with its midnight emergencies. Summer required moving herds to better grazing and preparing for market drives. But here's what the doubters didn't know about Sarah McKinnon. She'd grown up on her father's ranch in Missouri before marrying Thomas. She could spot a sick calf from 100 yards, knew which grass made the best hay, and understood cattle behavior better than most cowboys. While other ranchers' wives focused on preserving fruit and mending clothes, Sarah studied weather patterns and calculated profit margins. The townspeople expected failure within 6 months. The neighboring ranchers kept their offers ready for when desperation set in. The bank prepared foreclosure papers just in case. What they didn't expect was Sarah's response to their collective skepticism. Instead of crumbling under pressure or accepting defeat, she made a decision that would surprise everyone, including herself. The funeral flowers were barely wilted when she made her first decision. Standing in the dusty ranch office, surrounded by her husband's leather-bound ledgers and weathered maps, she picked up his iron brand from the mantel. The metal was cold, heavy in her hands. She wouldn't change it. The Dawson name would stay on every head of cattle, every fence post, every deed. Her neighbors expected tears and surrender. Instead, she laced up her boots at dawn and rode out to survey what was now entirely hers. 2,300 acres of Texas rangeland stretched before her, dotted with mesquite and crossed by 3 seasonal creeks. She knew every windmill by the sound it made in the wind. The North Pasture windmill squeaked on the second rotation. The one by Devil's Canyon had a loose blade that rattled in strong gusts. Most ranch wives stayed in the kitchen. She'd been riding fence lines since she was 12. Her first challenge came faster than expected. By noon that day, 4 of the 6 remaining ranch hands appeared at her door with their hats in their hands and apologies on their lips. "Nothing personal, ma'am," said the oldest, a weathered cowboy named Pete who'd worked the ranch for 8 years. "But the boys and me, we just don't feel right taking orders from a woman. Bad luck, you understand." Bad luck. The only bad luck she could see was losing experienced hands when spring roundup was 2 weeks away. After they rode off, she stood alone in the empty bunkhouse, counting 4 abandoned bedrolls and wondering how she'd manage 3,000 head of cattle with 2 green boys and sheer stubbornness. Then there's the matter of those 2 boys, Tommy and Jake, both 16, both orphaned by last winter's influenza outbreak. Every ranch in the county had turned them away. Too young, too inexperienced, too much trouble. She found them sleeping in the hay loft of Peterson's abandoned barn, thin as fence posts and twice as stubborn. "You boys know anything about cattle?" she asked. Tommy, the taller one with sandy hair and hopeful eyes, straightened up. "We know plenty about being hungry, ma'am. Figure we can learn the rest." Fair enough. She hired them on the spot for $15 a month each, plus meals and a real bunk. The look on their faces was worth losing those other hands. But the real surprise waited in her husband's desk drawer, tucked behind a stack of unpaid bills that made her stomach clench. 3 months behind on the banknote, overdue payments to the feed store, a stack of IOUs that added up to more money than she'd seen in her entire life. Well, that explained why Tom had been so quiet those last few months. Hidden beneath the bills, wrapped in an old piece of leather, she found something that changed everything. A hand-drawn map in Tom's careful script, marking a spot near the old oak grove with a simple X. Below it, in his familiar handwriting, emergency fund, $847 beneath the third fence post east of Lightning Tree. Her husband had been preparing for hard times. The question was whether $847 would be enough to keep the ranch running until she could prove herself. She tucked the map into her vest pocket and smiled for the first time since the funeral. Tom always was better at planning than talking. The next morning, she rode out with Tommy and Jake to check the eastern fence line. Sure enough, the third post east of the lightning-struck oak was loose. Digging down 2 feet, they found a sealed jar containing every dollar Tom had managed to save over 15 years of careful ranching. "Holy cow," whispered Jake, staring at more money than he'd ever seen. "What do we do now? Now?" Now she had enough to pay the most pressing debts and buy feed for the spring. More importantly, she had proof that her husband believed she could handle whatever came next. He wouldn't have shown her that hiding spot if he didn't trust her judgment completely. Standing there in the morning sun, watching her 2 young hands secure the fence post with the care of men twice their age, she made her second big decision. Everyone in town expected her to fail because she was a woman. They'd be watching, waiting, ready to swoop in and buy her land for pennies when she collapsed under the pressure. That wasn't going to happen. She'd proved that running a ranch successfully had nothing to do with what you were born with between your legs and everything to do with what you carried between your ears. The Dawson Ranch would thrive under her leadership, even if she had to work twice as hard as any man to make it happen. What she didn't know yet was that 1848 would bring changes to the law that would make her fight a whole lot easier. Nobody expected what happened next. The year 1848 brought something revolutionary to the American frontier: the Married Woman's Property Act. This wasn't just another dusty piece of legislation gathering cobwebs in some government office. This law changed everything for widows like our ranch owner, giving them the legal right to own and control property in their own names. But here's the thing about laws on paper versus reality on the ground. They're two completely different animals. She learned about the new law from a traveling merchant who stopped by her ranch for water. "Ma'am, you might want to get yourself down to the county office," he told her, adjusting his hat against the sun. "Heard tell that widows can officially claim their land now. Make it all legal-like." The merchant probably had no idea he'd just handed her the key to everything. Well, that's exactly what she did. 3 days later, she rode into town with her husband's old property papers tucked safely in her saddlebag. The county office sat on Main Street, a small wooden building that smelled of ink and important decisions. When she walked through that door, the two clerks behind the desk nearly dropped their coffee cups. "Ma'am, you sure you're in the right place?" asked the younger clerk, his voice cracking slightly. The older one just stared like she'd grown a second head right there in front of him. Neither of them had ever processed property papers for a woman before. They shuffled through law books, whispered to each other, and kept glancing at her like she might disappear if they looked away too long. But the law was the law. Makes sense, right? After 2 hours of bureaucratic fumbling, her name appeared in the official ranch registry for the first time. Not as widow of or formerly belonging to, just her name, bold as brass on the county books. She walked out of that office as the legal owner of 2,400 acres of prime grazing land. The news spread faster than a prairie fire in August. By evening, half the town knew what had happened. The other half found out over breakfast the next morning. Then there were the reactions. Boy, were there reactions. "This ain't natural," grumbled old Pete Morrison at the general store. "A woman owning land like that? Next thing you know, they'll want to vote." His cronies nodded along, their faces serious as funeral directors. They acted like she'd personally insulted their mothers and stolen their horses all at once. And the weird part is, some folks worried about their own property values. Martha Henderson, who ran the boarding house, cornered anyone who'd listen. "Female landowners will ruin everything," she declared, waving her hands dramatically. "Who's going to want to buy property next to a ranch run by a woman? The whole area will go to pieces." Let's not forget the more colorful commentary from the saloon crowd. "Bad luck," they muttered into their whiskey glasses. "Mark my words, that woman's going to bring misfortune on all of us." As if her legal ownership of land could somehow curse the weather or make their cattle grow extra legs. But why did these reactions run so deep? Simple. Nobody had seen anything like this before. The frontier operated on unwritten rules that men handled business while women handled everything else. Her official ownership paper shattered those assumptions like a hammer through glass. Well, not everyone opposed the change. The town's only female doctor, a stern woman named Dr. Sarah Collins, stopped by the ranch a week later. "Congratulations," she said simply, shaking hands like they were sealing a business deal. About time the law caught up with common sense. Dr. Collins understood exactly what those papers represented: freedom to make decisions without asking permission from every man in town. The local preacher had mixed feelings, which made for some interesting Sunday sermons. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he'd say, then pause meaningfully while his congregation shifted in their pews. He never quite condemned her ownership, but he never fully endorsed it either. Smart man, that preacher. Things got more complicated when neighboring ranchers realized what her legal status meant for business dealings. Previously, they could ignore her or try to work around her, assuming she'd eventually sell to a man. Now they had to acknowledge her as an equal property owner, whether they liked it or not. Her two teenage ranch hands thought the whole situation was hilarious. "Miss, you should see their faces when you walk into Murphy's store," one of them told her, grinning. "Like they're watching a cow recite Shakespeare." The legal victory felt good, but She knew paperwork alone wouldn't run cattle or fix broken fences. Having her name in the county registry was just the beginning. The real test would come when drought, predators, and creditors started circling her ranch like vultures around a wounded animal. The harsh reality of ranch life hit like a sledgehammer to the chest. Nature doesn't care about your determination or your late husband's dreams. Coyotes started picking off calves during their first week alone on the range. She'd wake up to find torn fences and blood trails leading into the scrub brush. The pack was smart, too smart. They'd test different sections of fence line each night, looking for weak spots like seasoned burglars. Drought followed close behind the predators. Wells that had never failed began showing their muddy bottoms. Streams that once ran year-round turned into cracked earth and bleached stones. Her cattle gathered around the few remaining water sources, trampling the ground into dust bowls. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd fought so hard to keep the ranch, only to watch it slowly dying under the merciless sun. Then, the bank came calling. Her husband's debts weren't just numbers in a ledger anymore. They had faces, deadlines, and consequences. The banker arrived in his pressed suit, looking completely out of place against the weathered ranch buildings. He spoke in clipped sentences about overdue payments and foreclosure timelines. His words felt like nails being hammered into a coffin she wasn't ready to build. Mrs. Dawson, your husband borrowed against future cattle sales that, well, they're not materializing as expected. She wanted to laugh at the understatement. Future cattle sales? Half her herd was scattered across 3 counties looking for water, and the other half was becoming coyote dinner. The storm that destroyed the barn roof came at the worst possible time. Makes sense, right? When you're already down, nature decides to pile on. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing through the valley with unprecedented fury. She huddled in the main house with the 2 orphan boys, listening to the sounds of destruction outside. Metal sheets screamed as they ripped away from the barn frame. Months of carefully stored hay and feed disappeared into the night, scattered across the prairie like expensive confetti. Morning revealed the full damage. The barn looked like a giant had taken a bite out of it. Her winter feed supply, the safety net she'd counted on to get through the harsh months ahead, was gone, ruined. The orphan boys stood beside her in the wreckage, their young faces showing a maturity that broke her heart. They'd already seen too much hardship in their short lives. But here's where things got interesting. Those boys didn't see disaster. They saw opportunity. While she was calculating losses, they were already planning repairs. They dragged old wagon wheels from the abandoned homestead 2 miles north, twisted them into makeshift supports for the damaged roof sections, scavenged barbed wire from failed fence lines, and repurposed it into temporary bracing. "Ma'am, we can make this work," the older boy said, his voice cracking between childhood and manhood. "Pa used to say broken things sometimes end up stronger than new ones." Their resourcefulness sparked something in her tired spirit. She watched them work with salvaged materials, their hands already calloused from ranch work, and realized she wasn't facing these challenges alone anymore. The mercantile became her lifeline. She'd started making cheese from her few remaining dairy cows, aging it in the cool cellar her husband had dug years earlier. The wheels of sharp cheddar became currency in a world where cash was scarce. The store owner initially scoffed at the idea of bartering cheese for farming equipment. A new plow cost real money, not homemade dairy products. "This isn't how business works, Mrs. Dawson." "Well, your customers seem to think otherwise," she replied, nodding toward the growing crowd of townspeople eager to trade for her cheese wheels. Word had spread about the quality of her product. The drought had made fresh food precious, and her cheese aged better than most store-bought alternatives. Soon, she was trading not just for plows, but for seed, tools, and even lumber for barn repairs. The weird part is how these disasters started connecting in unexpected ways. The destroyed barn forced her to redesign the entire operation. The new layout, built with salvaged materials and creative solutions, actually worked better than the original. Cattle could access water more efficiently. Feed storage was more protected from weather. The orphan boys had accidentally created improvements while making repairs. Each setback taught lessons that textbooks couldn't provide. She learned which water sources lasted longest during dry spells, discovered that certain fence configurations deterred coyotes better than others, found suppliers willing to work with creative payment arrangements. The learning curve was steep and unforgiving. Every mistake cost money she didn't have or cattle she couldn't afford to lose. But something else was happening during these brutal months of education. Her reputation was quietly shifting among the neighboring ranchers who expected her to fold under pressure. The first rule of ranching? Never show weakness. When 20 head of cattle vanished overnight, every eye in town watched to see if the widow would crumble. The local men crossed their arms and waited. This was it. This was when she'd finally pack up and head back east, where women belonged. But here's what they didn't expect. She strapped on her husband's old rifle at dawn. The weapon was nearly as tall as she was, but she'd been practicing with it every morning since the funeral. Her 2 teenage hands tried to follow, but she shook her head. Stay here. Keep the remaining herd close. Then she rode out alone into the dark hills where the tracks led. Most folks would have gone to the sheriff first. Not her. She knew the sheriff's office would take 3 days just to form a posse, and by then her cattle would be halfway to Mexico. The rustlers had picked the wrong woman to mess with. What happened next sounds like something from a dime novel, but the tracks don't lie. She followed those thieves for 18 hours straight, stopping only to water her horse at Hidden Springs. When she finally caught up with them at a canyon camp, they were cooking her beef over an open fire. Makes sense, right? Nothing says guilty quite like eating the evidence. The confrontation lasted less than 5 minutes. 3 men against 1 woman with a rifle she could barely lift. But fear works both ways. They weren't expecting a widow to track them through rough country. They certainly weren't expecting her to know every ridge and waterhole better than they did. She got her cattle back, all 20 head. Then there's the matter of unlikely allies. While she was proving herself against rustlers, help came from an unexpected source. A Comanche woman named Windwalker approached her property line one morning, leading a spotted pony. Most white settlers would have reached for their guns. The widow offered coffee instead. Windwalker spoke broken English mixed with Spanish, but her message was clear. She'd been watching the ranch, noting the problems. "Water here," she said, pointing to areas that looked bone dry. "Coyotes not here." She drew maps in the dirt, showing natural barriers that could protect cattle from predators. This partnership raised eyebrows all over the county. White ranchers barely trusted each other, let alone Native Americans. But the widow understood something her neighbors didn't. Survival trumps prejudice every time. Windwalker knew this land better than anyone, and knowledge was exactly what the widow needed. Let's not forget the power of female solidarity. While the widow was building her unlikely alliance with Windwalker, another widow named Mrs. Patterson approached her with a business proposition. Patterson had lost her husband to cholera and was struggling with a smaller spread 20 miles south. 2 small herds make 1 strong drive, she said simply. The joint cattle drive idea was revolutionary. Nobody had tried combining herds from different ranches, especially not with women in charge. The logistics alone seemed impossible. Different brands, different routes, different buyers. But both women understood something their male counterparts missed. Competition works until cooperation works better. Their first joint drive moved 90 head to market. They split costs, shared risks, and doubled their bargaining power with buyers. The math was simple. 2 desperate sellers could be lowballed. 2 organized businesswomen commanded respect. And the weird part is, just when things started looking up, a new threat emerged. An Eastern Railroad agent named Cornelius March arrived in town wearing a fancy suit and carrying official-looking papers. His mission? Acquire prime ranch land for the expanding rail system. March went door to door, sweet-talking ranchers about the benefits of selling their best grazing land. Progress waits for no one, he'd say, flashing government documents. Most men listened politely, then showed him off their property. They understood that railroads meant the end of open-range ranching. But March saw the widow differently. Here was a woman struggling to keep her ranch afloat, facing debts and challenges on all sides. Easy prey. He offered her twice what the land was worth, assuming she'd jump at the chance to escape ranch life. He assumed wrong. The widow had spent months learning every inch of her property. She knew which sections had the best water access, the richest grass, the most protected winter shelter. The land March wanted wasn't just her best grazing area. Without it, the entire ranch would collapse. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about the railroad companies thinking they could steamroll anyone who stood in their way. Well, This widow had news for Cornelius March and his fancy Eastern investors. She was about to show them what real Western grit looked like. Because sometimes the best defense isn't just holding your ground. Sometimes you need to prove that your way of doing things works better than anyone imagined possible. The breakthrough came when she made a decision that seemed crazy to everyone watching. While her neighbors stuck with the same cattle breeds their fathers had used, she started crossbreeding her longhorns with hardier stock. The results? Her cattle could handle the brutal Texas heat better than anything else in the county. Her neighbors laughed at first. "That widow's lost her mind," they'd say at the general store. "Mixing breeds like that will ruin good cattle." Well, they weren't laughing when her herd started putting on weight, while theirs grew skinny during the dry spells. The secret wasn't just in the breeding, though. She'd been paying attention to things other ranchers ignored. Those conversations with the Comanche woman had taught her about natural grazing patterns. Her cattle moved across the land in ways that actually helped the grass grow back stronger. Makes sense, right? While everyone else was wearing out their pastures, hers were getting better year after year. Then there was the fencing revolution she started. Most ranchers still used old methods that left gaps everywhere. Cattle wandered off, got stolen, or fell into ravines. But she developed a new technique using salvaged materials and strategic placement that kept her herd exactly where she wanted them. The two orphan boys had become experts at this fencing system, and word was spreading about how effective it was. The real game changer came when she decided to bypass the local cattle buyers entirely. These middlemen had been paying rock-bottom prices to ranchers for years, then selling the cattle for huge profits in Kansas. She hitched up her wagon, rode to the railhead town herself, and started negotiating directly with the Eastern buyers. The first trip was terrifying. A woman showing up at cattle auctions was unheard of. The buyers didn't know what to make of her. But when they saw the quality of her livestock and realized she knew every detail about her herd's health, breeding, and weight, they started taking her seriously. More importantly, they started paying her what her cattle were actually worth. By summer, something interesting was happening. While other ranchers were complaining about low prices from local buyers, she was getting nearly double for her stock. The math was simple. Better cattle plus direct sales equaled real profits. Her competitors were still stuck in the old system, getting cheated by middlemen who were getting rich off their hard work. And the weird part is, she was having fun with it. The challenge of outsmarting the established system energized her. Every successful sale felt like a victory, not just for her ranch, but for every woman who'd been told she couldn't handle business negotiations. Let's not forget the timing factor that made everything even sweeter. That autumn brought the worst drought in 20 years. Rivers dried up, grass turned brown, and cattle started dying across the region. Her neighbors watched helplessly as their herds grew weak and their profits disappeared. But her crossbred cattle thrived. The hardy genetics she'd been developing for 2 years suddenly showed their true value. While other ranchers were selling their skinny cattle at emergency prices just to cut their losses, her herd was still healthy and gaining weight. The drought became her opportunity. She started buying up distressed cattle from desperate neighbors at bargain prices. These were the same men who'd offered to buy her ranch cheap just a year earlier, convinced she'd fail. Now they were practically begging her to take their livestock off their hands. Her business sense kicked into high gear. She negotiated payment plans that helped her neighbors avoid complete bankruptcy while building her own herd to unprecedented size. Some folks called it shrewd business. Others whispered it was almost too clever for a woman. She just called it survival. The orphan boys had grown into skilled ranch hands who could handle any job on the property. Other ranchers started trying to hire them away, offering good wages for their innovative techniques. But the boys stayed loyal. They'd found something rare in the West, a boss who treated them with respect and taught them skills that made them valuable. By October, the numbers told an incredible story. Her ranch had tripled its cattle count while most others had lost half their herds. Her direct sales to Kansas buyers were bringing in more money per head than anyone in the county had ever seen. The ledger books that once showed her husband's unpaid debts now recorded steady profits month after month. The local bank president, who'd nearly foreclosed on her property just 18 months earlier, now tipped his hat respectfully when she walked down Main Street. Funny how a healthy bank account changes people's attitudes about a woman's business abilities. Word was spreading beyond their county borders about the widow who'd revolutionized ranching through smart breeding and direct marketing. But with success came new challenges that would test everything she'd learned about earning respect in a man's world. The county courthouse steps buzzed with excitement that crisp October morning in 1849. Posted on the wooden bulletin board were the official cattle sales records for the year. Every rancher in 3 counties crowded around to see the numbers. Her name sat right at the top. The pioneer widow, as folks had started calling her, had outsold every single ranch in the territory. Not just by a little, by nearly 40%. Men who'd been ranching for decades stared at those figures like they were written in a foreign language. "Must be a mistake," muttered old Pete Harrison, squinting through his spectacles. "Ain't no way a woman outsold my operation." But there it was, clear as daylight. Her longhorn sales topped the charts. Her wool production doubled the nearest competitor. Even her vegetable sales to the railroad camps brought in more money than most ranchers made from cattle alone. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. These same men had offered to buy her land for pennies just 2 years earlier, certain she'd be begging them to take it off her hands before winter hit. Well, winter had come and gone, twice. Then something remarkable started happening. The very men who'd scoffed at her methods began showing up at her gate with their hats in their hands. They wanted advice from a woman about ranching. "Ma'am," said Bob Fletcher, the same man who'd told everyone she'd be ruined within 6 months. "I heard tell you got some special way of finding water. My well's been running dry, and I got 200 head getting mighty thirsty." She shared her knowledge freely. The techniques the Comanche woman had taught her about reading the land, how to spot underground springs by watching where the grass grew greenest after rain, which trees meant water lay close to the surface. Other ranchers started copying her breeding methods too. Those hardy longhorns she'd developed could survive on half the water other cattle needed. During the brutal summer drought, while neighboring herds dropped like flies, hers kept gaining weight on scrub grass that would barely keep a jackrabbit alive. Let's not forget the 2 orphan boys she'd hired when nobody else would give them a chance. Those worthless street rats, as the town banker had called them, were now the most skilled riders at the monthly cattle auctions. Young Tom could rope a steer faster than men twice his age. Billy had an eye for spotting sick cattle that saved the ranch thousands in potential losses. The local newspaper couldn't ignore the story anymore. "The pioneer widow who outsold them all," read the headline in the Territorial Gazette. The article spread to papers in Kansas City, then St. Louis, then all the way to New York. Suddenly, she was famous. But the real change happened closer to home. Martha Wilson, whose husband had died in a mining accident, decided not to sell her small plot after all. She started raising chickens and selling eggs to the railroad crews. Sarah Mitchell took over her late father's sheep operation instead of letting her brothers divide it up. Young girls started asking different questions. Instead of, "When will I get married?" they wondered, "How do you breed cattle?" And, "What makes a good business deal?" The shift created ripples nobody expected. At church socials, conversations changed. Women talked about livestock prices and weather patterns alongside recipes and quilting. Some of the older men grumbled about it, but their complaints carried less weight when these same women were contributing real money to their households. And the weird part is, the more successful she became, the more enemies she made among certain folks. Success has a way of making small-minded people feel smaller. A few ranchers started spreading rumors about her methods. Maybe she was getting help from someone. Maybe those cattle numbers were inflated somehow. The accusations fell flat when the railroad inspector came through for his annual audit. Every head of cattle was accounted for, every transaction documented in her careful handwriting. Her books were cleaner than a Sunday dress. By year's end, 3 more widows in neighboring counties had taken over their late husbands' ranches instead of selling. 2 unmarried women had started their own small operations with money they'd saved from teaching and seamstress work. The precedent was set. Women could run ranches. Women could run them well. Women could run them better than most men, given the chance, but success brought new challenges nobody saw coming. With her name in newspapers from coast to coast, all sorts of attention was heading her way. Some of it welcome, some of it decidedly not. Visitors started showing up at her gate with proposals that had nothing to do with cattle and everything to do with the kind of legacy she was building for the next generation. Success has a funny way of changing everything around you. One day, you're the widow everyone expects to fail, and the next, you're building something that outlasts all the doubts. That's exactly what happened when she decided to construct a new bunkhouse on her property. But this wasn't just any ordinary building for ranch hands. The bunkhouse she designed was massive compared to what neighboring ranches offered. While most ranchers squeezed their workers into cramped quarters, she built spacious rooms with real beds and proper ventilation. Word spread fast about the comfortable accommodations, and suddenly the best cattle hands in 3 counties wanted to work for her. The same woman they once refused to work for was now their preferred employer. Then, there's the genius part of her plan. She didn't just house her own crew, she opened the bunkhouse to travelers passing through. Cattlemen, merchants, and even government officials started staying at her ranch instead of riding extra miles to town. Each guest paid good money for a clean bed and hot meals. What started as worker housing became a profitable side business that brought in steady cash year-round. Local school children began showing up at her ranch gates with their teachers. These weren't social visits, they were serious educational trips. Teachers wanted their students to see how successful business actually worked in the real world. She'd walk groups around the property, explaining everything from cattle breeding to bookkeeping. The kids listened with wide eyes as she showed them her ledgers, her breeding charts, and her water management systems. Makes sense, right? Who better to teach practical business skills than someone who'd built success from nothing? But here's where it gets interesting. These school visits weren't just about ranching, they were about proving that smart thinking and hard work mattered more than following old traditions about who could or couldn't run a business. Regional fairs started sending her official invitations to judge livestock competitions. This was huge. For decades, only the most respected ranchers got asked to judge cattle contests, and they were always men. Now fair organizers wanted her expert opinion on breeding quality, animal health, and livestock value. She'd walk through rows of prize bulls and champion horses, making decisions that could make or break a rancher's reputation. The weird part is how quickly everyone accepted her authority at these events. Ranchers who once laughed at the idea of a woman owning cattle now stood quietly while she examined their animals and announced winners. Her judgments carried real weight because her own herd's success spoke louder than any criticism. Well, speaking of her herd's reputation, her cattle brand became something special across multiple states. Buyers in Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico recognized her mark as a guarantee of quality livestock. When cattle cars rolled into railroad towns bearing her brand, prices went up automatically. Meat packers knew her steers would be healthy, well-fed, and worth premium prices. Let's not forget how this brand recognition changed everything for women in ranching. Her success opened doors that had been locked for generations. Widows across the region started taking control of their late husbands' properties instead of selling to male relatives. Young women convinced their fathers to let them handle cattle operations. Her example proved that gender had nothing to do with ranching ability. But why did her story spread so far beyond just cattle country? Newspapers from Chicago to San Francisco picked up her tale because it represented something bigger than one successful ranch. She'd proven that the American frontier rewarded skill and determination over social expectations. In a rapidly changing country, her story gave hope to anyone facing seemingly impossible challenges. The ripple effects kept expanding in ways she never expected. Other women started businesses in town, general stores, boarding houses, even small banks, using her ranch success as proof that female entrepreneurs could thrive in the West. Local churches began inviting women to speak at community gatherings about business and finance, topics previously reserved for men only. And the weird part is how the same men who once predicted her failure now claimed they'd always believed in her potential. Funny how success changes people's memories. The bank president, who nearly foreclosed on her property, started bragging about supporting local female entrepreneurs when talking to visiting investors. Her story became proof that any obstacle could be overcome with the right combination of grit, intelligence, and refusing to accept other people's limitations. She had turned mockery into respect, debt into profit, and doubt into lasting legacy. The ranch that everyone expected to fail had become the standard others tried to match. What started as a desperate widow's promise to keep her husband's dream alive had grown into something much bigger. Her success hadn't just saved one ranch, it had opened new possibilities for an entire generation of women who'd been told their dreams were too big for their circumstances. But her greatest challenge was still coming, and it would test everything she'd built.